So I'm here, of course, today to talk about Ember JS. Ember is a framework. I'm not going to shy away from the title. I know that's controversial. You're not supposed to be a library or a framework now. Anyway, Ember is a framework. It's an application framework. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about basically three big things. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is Ember and how does it fit into the context of what 2013 on the web looks like. I'm going to do a live demo for 20, 25 minutes, showing you what it really looks like to build an Ember application. And then I'm going to close by talking about what it looks like, what the future of the web looks like, and how Ember fits in. So I think these are both what is going on now and what is going on in the future matters. I think Ember makes some specific decisions based on both of those things, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit. So the first thing I want to say is it's never been a better time to be a web developer. I think when I started doing web development in 2005, thank God the dark ages were over. There was more than one browser. There was not just IE6, but IE6 still had 90% market share. You can imagine writing anything in a world where that was the case. I think we owe a great debt of gratitude to a lot of people who poured in a lot of time and energy to make the web advance in an era where all we had was this really terrible, at that point already 5-year-old web browser. But today we have three really big players that are all investing a lot of time and energy into the future of the web. So Google, of course, you can look at Chrome experiments for some stuff that works in Chrome. Even Microsoft has been doing HTML5 labs. I think what's really exciting about this stuff is that they've actually been delivering extensions that you can install into the browser that add HTML5 features. So of course, IE is a little bit slower of a browser than other browsers, but they deliver these experiments that you can install, like geolocation, before geolocation landed in IE, just to see what it would feel like to use it in IE. So they're doing really cool stuff, and I think IE finally is not as laggy, so maybe someday it will be caught up, but they're doing, I think, working really hard to make the web cool. And I think Mozilla is doing also a ton of really hard work. I think Firefox OS has really been pushing them hard. They've just announced a partnership with Epic to bring the Unreal Engine to the web. They've been doing stuff recently like Ember JS, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But I think everybody, basically, all of the browser engines, the world has changed a lot since 2005. And all the browser engines are really pushing hard. And so the world today is great. It's really a great time to be a web developer. I think it's only getting better. But even today, I think people have it's really common because of the fact that in 2005, 5 years had passed and we were looking at the same IE6. It was really common to say, well, it's great that the WhatWG is doing all this work to build HTML5, but when will we ever be able to use it? And people just sort of developed a tick. When will I ever be able to use that? 2020, 20 years from now. Nervous tick every time you talk about new features. And people just still say that. You say, oh, there's a great new feature. There's like WebGL. Oh, when will I be able to use it? And people don't really stop to think about the fact that over the past 5 years, so not 2005, but let's say 2008 to 2013, the pace of web development has actually changed dramatically. So something that was a pipe dream in 2000 was probably still a pipe dream in 2005, but almost all the pipe dreams from 2008 are done. Almost all of them are in IE10. So the pace has changed a little bit. So the first question I want to ask here is, so we have a website like the New York Times, and we have a website like Discourse. So how many people have heard of Discourse? Awesome, a lot of people. So Discourse is a piece of forum software by, it's a piece of forum software. It uses Ember, but that's not really the point. It's by Jeff Atwood, and the idea is basically just to make forum software more up-to-date with what is going on in 2013 as opposed to what was going on in the mid-90s, which is where most of the forum software that exists today is. So on the left is the New York Times, which is, of course, a content site, and on the right is Discourse. So if I ask you what's the difference between these sites, I think the language of how we talk about these things actually really impacts how we think about things, and I think for ill. So the answer is actually not how much JavaScript is on the page. So a lot of people call Discourse a JavaScript-heavy app, and the New York Times a something other, the opposite of a JavaScript-heavy app. And in fact, if you look at how much JavaScript there is on the page, what you'll find is that the New York Times has 802 kilobytes of JavaScript, and Discourse has 284 kilobytes of JavaScript. That's over the wire, of course. Once you uncompress, it's a different ballgame. And I'm not saying this to toot my own horn, to say Ember's great. I'm not talking about saying that Discourse is great. Something along the same lines, about 200, 300K of JavaScript over the wire, which expands to something like a megabyte of JavaScript uncompressed. That's just sort of the way of things. But what I'm getting at is that almost every site, even content sites, have used a lot of JavaScript. And that's things like ads, it's things like syndicated video, it's things like just random JavaScript that some framework that the New York Times uses for some kind of widget thing that they might be using from time to time. So it's just simply not that the New York Times is a pure content site. People often say things like, oh, yeah, HTML is really designed for documents. So look at the New York Times. That's an example of a document site. And then you look at something like Discourse. That's really not what the web is designed for. We shouldn't be building that stuff on broken tech. But in fact, the New York Times is doing exactly the same thing. The New York Times is even worse. The New York Times is just basically throwing dollops and dollops of JavaScript at it. I think what the real difference is between a site like the New York Times and a site like Discourse is how long you expect the site to be on the page. And that actually really impacts how you should think about what the JavaScript that is on your page should be doing. So the New York Times, their applications live for a very short amount of time. And they're doing things like streaming video. Because even though your app might be there a short amount of time, if you land on a video page, you want to watch video. So they have some JavaScript that handles video. They still want to serve ads. Where Discourse, their app is going to be on the page for a very, very long time. So a lot of what the code in Discourse is doing, and largely through a framework, is managing what it means to have so many objects that have different life cycles. So in Ember, we basically say, OK, there's going to be a lot of objects on the page. We're going to help you manage them in terms of what those objects are doing. So there are some objects on the page. And I use the term model, controller, and view here, not because Ember is I don't want to try to figure out through archaeology what kind of MVC something is. I think we've basically, unfortunately, lost the ability to talk reasonably about that. But just because these are the names that Ember uses for these objects. And so when we call something a model, what we mean is that that is a piece of object, that is an object or a piece of state that is going to persist across all the sessions. If you reload the page, you get that same object back. We call something a controller if it manages state that is not going to be there over the lifetime of the application, even if you refresh. But if you move around the application and don't refresh or don't open a new page or don't share it with a friend, you want to keep that state. So that's things like there's a tree and someone has expanded a little triangle next to something and now it's shown. Obviously, if you go to another tab and come back to it, you still want that expansion to exist. But that doesn't necessarily mean that when you reload the page, you want that expansion to exist. And finally, there's another type of state, which is basically state that represents only things that are currently on the page. Now, you might think, you might be going to a lot of trouble to break these pieces of state up, but you get two really good benefits from breaking it up in this way. And before I say anything more, I'll say I think a lot of frameworks basically try to take the middle piece and move it into one of the other sides. So for example, I think Backbone's philosophy is anything that's not about what's physically on the screen right now should be called a model. And I think that's great. I think Backbone really tries to drive dramatic simplicity in their nomenclature. But I think it is definitely the case that some Backbone models are going to be persisted to the server and will be replenished from the server when you reload the page. And some Backbone models are actually transient. They're temporary. They're based on the current state. So I think it's useful to have names to talk about the difference between those two things, even though both of them are just driving what is going to eventually be in views. So what benefits do we get out of actually thinking about things in this way? The first benefit is JavaScript, unfortunately, right now does not have any kind of weak ref system. So there's going to be garbage that gets generated just by virtue of having a page. I think you might remember a long time ago if you tried to leave Gmail open for a long time, for like 10 hours, 12 hours, you basically run out of memory on your computer. And that's because, unfortunately, in JavaScript, even though it's a garbage collected language, when you have a large web of objects, it's not enough to rely on the garbage collector to just nuke everything all the time. You end up with objects that stay around for some reason or other. And one of the things that we get out of dividing up your state into these three buckets is that it becomes a lot easier for us to reason about when we as a framework can aggressively tear things down. So if we have something that is a view state, we know that when you leave that area of the screen, we can tear it down aggressively and anything attached to it. And of course, we're not going to tear down your model. So there are some frameworks that say garbage collection is so important that whenever you leave a screen that's showing a model, destroy the model. Of course, that means that you have to go make another HTTP request to get the information back if you go back to the tab, which is kind of defeats the entire purpose of using a framework like this in the first place. So I think it's important to think clearly about what kind of state you're really talking about. And by Ember giving you some tools for describing your state easily in these three buckets, it's a lot easier for us to think about when it is OK to tear down something and all the things that it's connected to. And the other thing is, I think the flip side of that coin is that it makes it a lot easier for you to think about how to organize things. So if you're just putting everything that's not DOM in a model, it's a lot harder for you to think about, okay, what is actually going on here? How are these objects connected to each other? And in Ember, it's nice that you can say, okay, this is some information that's just basically super transient. It's like what field has focus right now. That's obviously not controller state. It's something that's very, very focused on whatever's on the screen. So you can think about breaking your app apart into sane layers that's based on this kind of concept. So that's sort of thing number one about Ember that I want to talk about. The second thing is Ember's HTML. And I think a few years ago, this was a bigger thing to talk about. So a few years ago, things like Sprout Core and Cappuccino and EXTJS and YUI were all super popular. They controlled a lot of the app space. So jQuery controlled a lot of the library space, but the framework space was dominated by people who tried to abstract the DOM. They said, HTML sucks. HTML is broken. HTML was designed for documents. What is a URL? Get out of here. What we're going to do is we're going to abstract the entire thing. We're going to port Cocoa, like Cappuccino. We're going to literally port Objective-C to something that compiles to JavaScript. And unfortunately, I think none of those things really succeeded because the reality is that developers and designers know how to use HTML. They know how to use CSS. And HTML actually is a pretty nice way of describing hierarchical UI. So something that maybe is controversial, but I don't think it is very much anymore, is something like XML is actually a very nice way of describing hierarchical UI. I say XML. In this case, I really mean HTML. But something where you have, oh, I have a hierarchy. Oh, great. I have a hierarchy of tags. Awesome. And I think people know how to work with that. They know how to think about it. It's not an accident that things like Flex and Silverlight ended up adopting similar models. It is also not an accident that they failed. But I think at the end of the day, people know how to use HTML. People know how to use CSS. There's a ton of people. You hire a designer. You don't want them to have to learn a whole new theming system written in JavaScript. And so Ember really, really doubles down on things that are normal to do in static land in HTML are going to be done using HTML and Ember. So just one simple example of this is you can see on top is an image tag. The image tag has existed forever and ever and ever. And on the bottom, you see an audio tag, which is relatively new. And one really nice thing about the DOM and how HTML proceeds is that there's not really any new APIs for saying here's a tag and its attributes, which means that the audio tag, of course, inserting an audio tag into the page and twiddling its attributes works exactly the same as it works to insert an image tag and twiddle its attributes, which means that by us embracing HTML, by us saying the way that you bind to attributes is through HTML, the way that you insert things into the page is through HTML, we don't have to do anything special to support an audio tag or a video tag or some new thing that's going to come down the pike next year. It's basically just baked in because that's already the DSL. I sometimes like to say the best DSL for HTML is HTML. So these things are basically equivalent, and I think one measure, if you're looking at frameworks, is like, are these things actually equivalent in your framework? Are they roughly the same, or is there something you have to do to get the top one that is specific to some hard-coded image tag solution that you can't just easily do the bottom one in? Again, I think the vast majority of frameworks have adopted this mentality. I think everybody knows that this is the right thing. And in general, what we try to do is we try to say, OK, we have HTML. We want to add some dynamic features to HTML. Let's add some syntax. We use Handlebars, which is a rather popular templating engine, as the core syntax piece for Ember. Actually, YUI and Meteor also use the Handlebars syntax for its data bindings. So I think that's pretty standard. And the idea, again, is just to have an extension syntax that is HTML plus dynamic parts that we can then use to hook data bindings into. So that's number 2. And then the final thing I want to talk about in terms of what the world of the web is today that is, I think, very important, and I think if you take one thing away from this entire talk, it would be this section, is URLs are crucially important to the web. Now, when you look at the first version of To Do MVC, what you find is it's very easy when you start building a web application. Let me back up, actually. So when you build a static site, when you build a Rails site or a Django site or a PHP site, you have no choice but to use URLs because every single thing you do goes back to the server, so you need a URL. And one happy accident of that, or maybe not so happy accident, depending on how much of a crystal ball you think Tim Berners-Lee had. One happy accident from that is that you basically get the ability to share on Twitter, on Facebook, via email with your friends. You get the ability to bookmark, open a new tab, et cetera, automatically if you build a Rails app. But I think people say, OK, Rails apps are too slow. Rails apps, Django apps, PHP apps, they're too much back and forth to the server. I want to simplify that. I want to make a lot of the logic happen in the client. And then somehow along the line, because of the fact that they're focusing on that, they lose track of the fact that the URL is the important aspect of what is happening in the web. That the URL is the main UI of the web. So the first version of To Do MVC actually did not have routing support at all. It was basically just like, here's a single page app, go to town. You can see that obviously once you start thinking about it, Addy realized that routing is crucial, and he got most frameworks to add routing support to their demos. There's now a spec basically that requires you to do it if you do To Do MVC. But round one of To Do MVC had no routing support, no URLs at all. But when you look at polished applications like Discourse, Forum Software, or Facebook, keep your eye on the URL bar on top, or Twitter, or even things like Rdio, what you find is that these applications have really good URL support. And that's because they know that people expect web applications to have shareable, bookmarkable links. People expect to be able to go to the top of their page, grab a URL, and do something with it, whether that's sending email, whether it's Twitter, or whatever. So what you sometimes have instead is you sometimes have a share button. Like, think about the Google Maps experience. When you want to share a link with Google Maps, you have to go find a little link icon, click on it, and then do some stuff, and you get a URL. That's a terrible experience on the web, right? The web experience is supposed to be, I am someplace, I want to share it with my friend, let me go to the URL bar, copy it, and give it to them. I want to give it to them over IM, etc. People love sharing what they're looking at, and the URL bar is basically the UI that the web gives us for doing that. When I look at Twitter, I found that basically every single tweet almost had a URL in it. So basically, what are people doing on Twitter? You think of Twitter as this completely isomorphic, it's completely different from the web. It's completely the opposite of the web. You think of that, and but you find that everybody's basically sharing links to other things. Like I said, the URL is the UI of the web. And again, I think use cases are bookmarking, sharing, emailing, hitting Command Tab. I actually went to my email box when I was preparing for this talk, and something like 80% of all the emails that I had in my inbox had a URL to something. People really, really use URLs for all kinds of stuff. And I'll maybe go a step further and say, if your application does not have URLs, it's not a web app. It's an application. It's written using JavaScript. It's delivered over the web platform, but it's not a web application. What makes a web application and not a native application is that you can share where you are with other people. And it's responsible for the viral growth of the internet. Now, one thing I think is interesting is once you accept this and once you start building applications that have no compromise URLs from day one, what you realize is that there is places where you would never in a million years think that you should have URLs, where it's really natural and really great to have URLs. So an example of this is you're playing a first-person shooter and you want your friend to join you. Grab the URL, give your friend the URL, they click on it, boom, now they're in the same level as you. Of course, the URL is not going to have every single piece of state information. It's not going to say exactly where you are. It's not going to say how many lives you have. It's not going to have all that state. But it's going to have enough information for you to basically say, do the thing that the URL means, which is, hey, join me here. Go look at the thing that I'm looking at. You can imagine I'm looking at Gmail, and I see that you were CC'd on an email that I'm looking at, and I want you to look at that email. How does that work now? Because URLs are broken in Gmail. The way it works now is I say, hey, why don't you search for this subject line in your search box, and hopefully it will come up, maybe, if you're lucky. And what would be great is if I could say, oh, I see that you're CC'd. Here's a link. Click on the link, boom. Gmail sees that you're CC'd. You have access to the same email. You can see it just the same. And finally, I think my favorite example of this is if you go into Chrome and start poking around the settings, you'll find that every single thing you do changes the URL bar, even if you open a modal dialog, which means if my mom calls me and she says, hey, I'm trying to clear my cookies. How do I do that? I can go click around, go to clear my cookies, grab the URL from the URL bar, give her the URL, and done. She can go do it directly without me having to give her a whole bunch of instructions. So I think my point is, you shouldn't be thinking about whether, when someone is using your application on the web, whether it should have a URL. You don't want to have an experience like Gmail or Google Maps. You want to have an experience like Rdio or Twitter or Facebook, where if you're looking at something that should be shareable with another person, that there's an easy way to share that with somebody else. OK, so that's the first part of my talk. The next part of my talk is I'm going to try to build something for you. So hopefully this will work. So I should switch to, OK, awesome. Can people in the back see this? Hopefully good enough. Awesome, great. So here I have an Ember app. It's basically the starter kit. I'm going to call out a couple of changes that I've made to the starter kit, just to get you to realize that they're not standard. So the first one is I have installed Twitter Bootstrap here, bootstrap.css. I've also switched to the Ember Nightly instead of Ember, the latest RC. Soon there will be RC4, which will have the stuff that's in here. And I've also installed a Markdown library, because what we're going to build is an application for viewing a set of Markdown files. So we have a Markdown library that converts Markdown into HTML. If you go into the app file, you will find basically the standard setup over here. And then I basically just for simplicity, just to get through this, I have a series of files, which is just an array of files. And then over here, all I'm doing is I'm looping through those things, and I'm basically indexing them by their ID, so that it's easy for me later on to go say, OK, I want the blog post named Rails' Omakase or whatever. Now, I think the important thing for me to point out is, of course, if you were building a real application, you would have some kind of server or some kind of API that both let you get a list of all the things and let you index by ID. Since I'm using simple JavaScript objects, I'm just doing that work here in a couple lines of code. OK, so let me open index.html. OK, cool. So of course, nothing is happening here since there's nothing on the page. And the first thing that I'll do is I'll just throw in an h1 that says hello Philly. This is going to suck. Scumbag Sublime. So here we have a script tag, and basically this script tag is saying this is the main part, the entry point for your application. It's a handlebars file. It's the main entry point for your application. And if I reload, you'll see, OK, great. Hello Philly, awesome. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to add a little bit of dynamic content. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an input tag. It's going to be an input type equals text, and it's going to have a value bound to name. Name is just something random that I'm selecting here that's going to be shared with the next thing that I type, which is an h1 that says markdown files by name. This is going to Zuck. OK. So I have an input field. So you can see these little curlies just mean that it's dynamic. It's not the normal input tag. It has some dynamic features attached to it. And I'm binding its value to name. And then I'm saying that this curlies over here are pointing at the same thing. So if I go in and I say Yehuda Katz, great. So now you can see that that name is pointing at the same thing. So awesome. Now, unfortunately, if I go reload the page, obviously it does not remember that I typed that, which does not seem optimal. So what we're going to do is we're going to just quickly save this to local storage. Now, I have a limited amount of time, so I'm not going to make everything savable to local storage. But this is basically just giving you an idea of how you might do something like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, OK, I would like to do something when the user hits enter. So I'm going to say action equals, let's say, save name. And so now I've set an action. And where does that action go? Well, I'm in the application template. So it's going to go into the app. It's going to be triggered on the application controller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let me make a little controller section here. I'm going to say app.application controller equals ember.controller.extend. And basically, Ember already made one of these for us before, but now we're being explicit because we want to actually have an action that is going to get triggered on it. And it was called save name. So that's going to take the value from the field as its parameter, and we're going to say local storage dot app name equals value. Now, of course, so that's going to save it to local storage, but it's not going to load it. So I'll show you that it will save it to local storage. So I'm going to say Yehuda Katz. That is annoying. I'm going to hit enter, and now if I go look at local storage, you'll see that it has the information, which is great. I should probably have cleared that. So let me clear it, and let me do that again. That is not what I meant to do. So you can see that it's in there. Great. Now, if I want that to be the starting point, then what I just need to do is I need to go and say, whenever the application controller is initialized, so this is basically just a constructor, I'm going to say this.set name to local storage.appName. And all that's basically saying is the name for this template should be whatever's in local storage.appName, and now I have a way to save it. So basically, when it gets loaded, it's going to pull the name out for here. It's going to pull the name out for there. So let me reload, and you can see, great, it says my name. And if I was to change it and hit enter, you will see that it does the right thing. So great. So now we have a way to connect two things, and we have a way to save them to local storage. So that's great in theory. The next thing that we want to do, though, is let's make a list of all the files. So we're not going to just keep tacking things onto the main template, because if we do that, we're not going to have URLs. What we're going to do is we're going to make a new template. Script type equals text / x handlebars. And we're going to say data template name equals files. Actually useful. OK, so the first thing I'm just going to grab, the Bootstrap stuff from the previous example over here that I had whipped up, and I'm just going to delete all the dynamic content. So this is basically just standard issued Bootstrap. It has a container, a row. I'll just do span 12 for now. So if I reload it, actually nothing's going to happen. Well, the reason nothing happened is that I actually have not gone to the files location. So let's do that. Let's go to /files. Well, still nothing happened. The reason nothing happened is that I have not actually told this template where to go. So it's basically going to render the template, and it's like, OK, where should I go in the application template? And the answer is, I have not told it. So let's go tell it. So basically all we do is we go into the application template, we say outlet, and basically what that is saying is that whenever you go to a different URL and you want to render a template, here's the location that you can put it in. If you've used Rails, it's like yield in Rails and application template, but it works at multiple nested levels, which I'll show you in a bit. So now it's basically saying, hey, you are trying to go to /files, but you have no route. So let's go here. We'll say this.resource files, and that's basically saying there should be a route called files, and when you go to it, it should render the files template. So boom, now we have the list of files. Great. So obviously, just having the text files is not that useful. At this point, you should be wondering why this is a dynamic website at all. So let's actually go and let's make some files. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to say each file in model. So each file in the model, which we'll assign in a moment. And then we're going to create a tr, a td, and we're going to say file.title by file.author. And if I go back there, if somebody knows somebody who works on Sublime, this is not the correct behavior. OK. So we reload, nothing happened. Well, the reason nothing happened, again, is I have not yet told it what the model should be for the files template. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a route called app.filesRoute. And basically, this is just a simple object that lets me configure things like what model should be used to render this template. So I'm going to say model function, and I'm going to just return the list of files that we have up here. So we have this array of files. And when I reload, great. So now we have the list of files. Awesome. Now, that's great, but we probably want to look at an individual file. So let's make a new template for an individual file. Script type equals text x handlebars, data template name equals file, script. And let's just go h2. Let me actually put an hr over here before the outlet. We'll say h2. It should be the title /h2, h3, by author /h3, div, and then we'll put the contents in over here. I'm crying so hard. OK, so I have my files here. Now what if I go to /files/Rails is omakase? Well, not surprisingly, nothing is going to happen because, and if we look here, you'll find that it's like, hey, what are you doing? This does not have any route. So we should go into our app and add a route for it. So this is going to be this.resource file. And basically, this is the first part is basically what template you should render, and by default, what the path name should be. And we're going to say the path in this case is /files/file ID. So that dynamic part over there, :file ID, is going to match the Rails' omakase part. Hold on, let me disable this real quick. Now, if we reload again, it's basically saying, hey, you use the dynamic segment called file ID, but you haven't actually said how to convert that dynamic segment into a model. So we know that there is a dynamic segment called Rails' omakase, but we don't actually know how to convert that into a model that should go into our file template. So we will basically need to do the same thing that we've done before, which is say app.fileRoute equals ember.route.extend. We say model. And this time we're going to get a params. We always get one, but it was empty before. And we're going to return files params.file_id. Right? So we're basically going to pull out the file ID that we got there, and we're going to look it up in the files hash that we built. And now if we refresh, awesome. So we have Rails' omakase. Great. So there's a couple of issues here, and I'll try to tackle them one at a time. The first issue is, well, that's great that I can manually go to this URL, but I probably would want to get to it from the list of pages. So let me go in and convert these into links. So in Ember, you just go #link2. You say where you're trying to go, which is an individual file, and then you say what the model is that should be populating that. In this case, it's just the individual file. Whoa, that is crazy. And then you say /link2, and we will reload, and now we get links. So if you look on the bottom, it doesn't seem to actually be working, but you can see that it works. And of course, the back and forward button is going to work. And if I was to, open link in a new tab, it'll of course work, right? So basically, you're getting, as you're building your application, in terms of these URLs, you're basically getting these URL behavior for free without having to think a lot about it. Okay, so now we have links there, but there's actually another problem. So let me go to this YRuby. We can see that there's something that is Markdown. It looks like Markdown, but obviously I'm rendering it not as Markdown. I'm rendering it as just HTML, which is not correct. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to use the Showdown library to convert that text into Markdown. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a helper. So we're going to say ember.handlebars.helper. It's going to be called Markdown. It's a function which takes the value, which is just going to be the HTML string. We're going to say var converter equals new showdown.converter. And we're going to say return converter.make HTML value. So basically what you would do to convert Markdown into HTML. So now let's, and of course we have to go tell the template to use that helper. So Markdown contents. Now, well, there's a small issue here. It's actually rendering it as HTML. So why is it rendering it as HTML? Well, the reason is that Ember comes built in with XSS protection. So by default, if you try to just dump HTML into the page, we will automatically escape it. If you would like us to not escape it, you have to explicitly tell Ember that it is safe. So let's do that. Let's go into our helper. We say return new handlebars.safeString. And we reload. Boom, now we have Markdown converted into HTML. Right, and now it's multiple paragraphs instead of one. Great. So that's number one. Number two is, okay, so this is great that we can go directly from a list into the list of into the individual articles. But what if I actually want to keep the list on the page at the same time as I go back and forth? So sort of like a master detail view, like Gmail or something like that. Well, basically all we're going to do here is we're going to do the nesting another level down. So let's start by going into our application, and we'll say, okay, we're going to actually nest the file route inside of the main files route instead of making it a totally separate thing. So we're going to put it inside. Of course, we don't need the files part anymore. Right? It's just an individual file ID. And so let's go to files. Let me open this in a new tab. So you can see nothing is happening. And the reason so there's one thing that's happening, which is that I'm clicking on the link and it's not actually going to the page. Right? It seems bad. But the reason why nothing is happening here is that the same as the first time. We haven't actually told the files template where to put the child, right? So it wants to put the child somewhere, but we haven't told it where to go. So all we're going to do here is we're going to make another div here. So let me change this from span 12 to span 3. And we're going to do a div class equals span 9. Cry a few tears. And throw in the outlet. And basically, the idea here is that you can nest it however many levels down. Of course, there's a reasonable limit to how many levels of nesting you can have in a UI. But Ember doesn't actually care if you go 12 levels down. We'll happily do it as long as your URL structure matches the UI. So here we've put in an outlet. And now if we reload, boom, we have Rails' omakase over there. And we have the file template on the right. Notice that there wasn't a lot of changes that we had to make this work. This worked just fine on its own. And another thing that I would point out is you can see YRuby and Rails' omakase, they're becoming bolded. So if I go look at this, you'll find that there's this active class on the A tag. So where did that active class actually come from? Well, when you use the link to helper in Ember, we automatically add an active class to whatever is currently active. So you don't have to do any additional work. All I did was in my CSS, I said, whenever it's active, make it bold, change the font color, and boom, it's done. Ember does it for you. So this is why, for example, why we use a helper as opposed to perhaps just trying to augment the A tag itself so that we can do fancier things like throwing in the active class for you. OK, awesome. So now we have a static page. Let's just move back and forth with our markdown. Well, what if we want to edit it? If we want to edit the markdown. So no problem. We'll throw in a couple of text fields. So let's go label for equals title, title/label. And then we're going to say, again, input type equals text, ID equals title so that it matches. And we're going to say value equals title. /p. Again, the curlies mean that it's dynamic instead of it just being a static tag. And we're just binding the value to the title. It's going to be the same title as here. So let me refresh. You can see, OK, Rails is omakase. If I ... if I bang, we'll do the right thing. It will modify all the places on the page where it's there. So let's add a couple more p tags. Does anyone know how much time I have, by the way? Nope. Seems. All right. I'm fine then. So we have a title here. We have an author. Whoops. Right. We just go change these things. And then this is going to be the contents. This time, though, we don't want it to be a text input type equals text. We want it to be a text area. Text area, ID equals contents, value equals contents. OK, great. Now if I reload, actually let me throw some rows on that. So let's say 10 rows. OK, great. And now if I go and change Rails is omakase, that's great. But you can also see that if I make something bold, it's going to work. And the important thing here is I didn't have to actually do anything special here to automatically update the markdown on the bottom. Right? It's basically all bound together. So because of the fact that I was using the markdown helper down there, and it's bound to the same underlying model information, it's going to automatically update, which is awesome. OK. Now, there's a couple of still niggling problems here. The first problem is I have a little template here which has some information about my title and author. I probably don't want to have to put all this form directly in the same place. I might want to break it out into a separate template. So let me do that. Let me go, I'll say partial file / let's say form. And then I'll go make a new script tag over here. File / form. Boom, put the stuff in there. Close the script tag. Now if I reload, basically everything's the same. Reloaded very quickly, I'm sorry. But everything's the same because we basically just broke it out into a separate thing. Now, one thing I want to say right here is while I'm doing this demo, I'm putting everything in one file, I'm putting everything in script tags. In production applications, people usually have tools that let them put these in separate files. So don't get the wrong idea that basically your application is going to be a giant HTML page full of script tags. That's not practically how it ends up happening. OK, so now we've done this. Now the last thing I want to do here is I want to say, OK, I don't actually want this form to always be present. I only want it to be present if the user presses edit. So I want to say, OK, I only want to show this form if there is an isEditing flag. And we'll get to how exactly that is going to work in a second. So if there's editing, show the flag. Otherwise, let's make a button, and we'll say the button's action is edit. And say edit. And let's say that after the partial, we're going to say button, and its action is done. And we're going to say done / button. So of course, at this point, we have no isEditing flag. It's going to be false. So when we reload the page, we're just going to have this edit button, which of course, when I click on, nothing's going to happen. And if you go and look in the console, it's like, hey, nothing handled the event edit. What is going on here? So we need to actually have something handle edit. And remember that we're in the file template. So the thing that's going to handle the event edit is going to be the file controller. So let's make us one of those. Let's go into our controller section. file controller equals Ember. This time it's going to be an object controller because it this template represents a single object. And what we're going to do is we're going to have, there's a property on it called isEditing. We're going to start it off at false. We're going to have an edit flag, an edit method rather, which is going to be what happens when the user clicks edit. We're going to say this.set is editing to true. And when done happens, we're going to say this.set is editing to false. Okay. So now let me refresh. And when I hit edit, boom, I get the list. When I hit done, it's false. So let me just take a step back and say again what is exactly happening here. So what's happening here is we have this template called file. And basically the data source for that file is what is called the file controller, which itself proxies some information from the underlying file model. So we started off with just basically a blank proxy, and it was letting us do things like show the model's title, show the model's author, et cetera. But then we said, OK, what we want is a little piece of state that only represents whether this form is editing. I don't want to put that on the model. Obviously, the individual file doesn't care if you're in the middle of editing it. That's some information that only belongs to this current application. If I refresh, I probably don't want to leave it in an editing state. So great, I'm going to have an object called a controller. And what I'm going to do is that controller is going to manage this editing property. And this if statement here is just automatically live bound. So whenever the property changes, Ember is automatically going to go, OK, it used to be false, and now it's true. OK, now I'm going to basically replace the contents with this. Otherwise, I'm going to replace the contents with that. So basically, with a little bit of code, you're just manipulating a property. You're basically able to cause it to show an editing field or not. And you can see these things compose pretty well. So you have a partial, of course, that just works just fine. One thing I want to point out in general is that the if statement and things like the if statement in Ember do not show and hide the contents that are under them. So you can have a really big piece of DOM inside of the top part and a really big piece of DOM in the bottom part. And you're not going to explode with large amounts of DOM that are just hidden at any time. I think it's really nice. It basically means that you can really see whatever's on the screen is really what's in DOM. Especially when you're in more resource-constrained environments, that really helps a lot. But even not, it's nice. OK, so that's, I think, the demo. I want to say, just out loud, I don't have time to do a local storage example. But I showed you a little bit of local storage in the beginning. What you could do in order to do local storage here is sort of the same strategy we did here, right? Whenever you say done, what you can do is you can basically go and save the information to local storage. And then and then when you boot up the app in the first place, instead of having this hard-coded list of files here, you basically just pull it out of local storage. And other than that, the entire application will stay exactly the same. If I had a little more time, I would do it, because it's pretty cool. But I want to move back to my talk. So hopefully that was helpful. That got you a little bit started with how it feels like to build an Ember application. And now I want to move on from building something to the future of the web. So I want to repeat again, it's never been a better time to be a web developer. 2013 looks basically like the pipe dream of 2008. It looks really great. It's really awesome. Mozilla just released a first-person shooter game that runs totally in the web, uses ASM JS, which is, again, I'll talk about in a second. It's using WebGL. It's using all these really advanced features. Even IE10 supports a lot of these things. So we're really making a lot of progress. Now, if I look at this list of features, these are a list of features that you expect to find in a native application. You expect to find the ability to malloc some memory. You expect to find sockets, open sockets. You expect to find threads. You expect to find the ability to interact with the GPU through OpenGL. You expect to find the ability to use assembler. And actually, in the web of the leading edge of the 2013 web, we have typed arrays, which basically give you the ability to write a blob of memory. And in fact, when you look at emulators that emulate like Linux or whatever, you go to some website on Hacker News, oh my god, they've run Linux. How are they doing that? Well, actually, they just have a malloc internally that's writing to a big typed array. We have the ability to open up sockets that are long-lived, that are basically let you do whatever you want. We have web workers, which basically allow you to offload computation to another thread. We have WebGL, which is basically OpenGL ported to the web. And we even have ASM JS. So how many people have heard of ASM JS? A few people. So basically, ASM JS is a classic web hack, but it's amazing. So basically, the idea is there is some subset of JavaScript, which is what mscriptin, which is basically a thing that compiles C to JavaScript, tends to emit. And basically, what they have done is they've written a subset of JavaScript that the browser can interpret as essentially typed code, typed C or typed assembler. So what you can do, and it ends up being about twice as slow as native right now, and they have hopes for something like 1.5 times the speed of native. So what you can do is you can basically go write some C code in a C, using C, use mscripting to compile it into JavaScript, go run it in a browser, and it will only be about 2 times slower or 1.5 times slower ultimately than what you would get if you just ran it on your machine without a browser. I think that's pretty amazing. I think that basically opens the doors for doing all kinds of crazy stuff that we have not seen yet, and I think we're basically getting to the point where speed is not at all a limitation. Now, you might say, oh my God, the web is just built on hacks on hacks on hacks. Actually, everything is built on hacks on hacks on hacks. The Unix is hacks on hacks on hacks. I think the awesome thing about this is that we basically you get C code, you compile it to JavaScript, and it's no less safe than JavaScript. So it's impossible to have a seg fault. Now, of course, the program can crash. You can have an exception in your JavaScript, but it's impossible for it to take down the browser because it's actually just JavaScript. So I think there's 2 ways to think about it. You could think about all this stuff as, oh my God, it's just another layer of crazy hacks. Or you could think of it as we're getting really, really close to the point where we have a real platform on the web where we can really build real things on the web. Another thing that's coming down the pike really soon, so something that I work on a lot, I have on TC39, which is the committee that makes JavaScript. Please, if you're a person who likes to hate on it, please hate on us a little less. I've been doing a lot of the work I've been doing over the past year or so has been just to involve more web developers, more regular web developers in the process. And there's now about 6 people on the committee that their full-time job is JavaScript. That's up from maybe 0 or 1 when I joined last May. So I think there's a lot more engagement. I think it's really awesome. Please hate less. Be awesome. Anyway, so ES6 is coming down the pike, the next version of JavaScript. One thing that's coming is classes. And so in terms from Ember's perspective, what classes give us is it gives us finally an interop point. So right now, Backbone and Angular and Ember and YUI, we all have our own, some people call it factories, some people call it classes, some people like to use more FP verbiage. But basically, if you have an object with a prototype on it and you can call new, or even if you can't call new, you have a thing that is class-like. And it's just very hard to interoperate because basically everyone wants to use their little abstraction or big abstraction to build their classes. And one thing that has me really excited is the idea that maybe we'll finally have we will finally have one abstraction for classes. And that I think will really increase the ability of the entire ecosystem to share code. And so you can see here, for example, class post extends backbone.model. I would imagine that things like backbone.model and ember.view will support the class syntax. I'm really looking forward to doing that. Another thing that has me really excited is web components. Basically, the idea behind web components is, OK, so there's all this magic on the web. There's input type equals text, input type equals range, there's buttons. They all do all kinds of crazy internal stuff. I don't really know what it's doing, but the browser's doing something. The idea behind web components is, what if we figured out how to explain what the browser is doing and actually expose functionality to the user so that you can make your own button tag, your own input tag, and you can basically get something that looks almost exactly like an input tag in user space. And one thing that's coming with web components is the ability to possibly subclass HTML elements. So not just this is a tag that happens to be an HTML element, but when you use a special dash button instead of a button, use this subclass of HTML element. Now, there's a lot of plumbing that's going on in TC39 and in the W3C to try to figure out what this even means, because there's backing C++ structures that come into play in the implementation. Trying to figure out how to actually make that work is pretty hard. But basically, my view of it is, once we're able to subclass HTML element, Ember View is just a specialized HTML element with some special features that make data binding easier. But we shouldn't have to write our own parallel hierarchy. We shouldn't have to do any of that anymore. We should basically get subclassing of HTML element. And in my participation in all the work that's going into web components, I've really been thinking a lot about what this means, what it would mean for Ember to be able to do this. Now, one thing that I should say in general is I think it's very good for frameworks like Ember to be looking at, OK, web components are coming out down the pike. They're opening the door to things like subclassing HTML element. What does that mean? Ember's philosophy on this is that we should think about, when we build our library, we should think about what it means to, what our architecture needs to look like so that we don't get screwed when those things come down the pike. In other words, we don't have to take a year off to try to adopt web components or ES6. But we're also not willing to sacrifice short-term performance or short-term usability in exchange for very, very high fidelity. So you could imagine that someone creates something that looks like your subclassing HTML element, but the amount of hacks that would be required in 2013 would be very slow and very brittle. And so we tend to shy away from things that would maybe have very high fidelity to some future feature, but which would be slow or which would be brittle. So I would say most of our architecture is, okay, so object.observe is coming down the pike. It will give us the ability to see when things change. Let's make sure that our internal observer system is very close to that. But let's not try to do something crazy that maybe doesn't let you have to use set and get today, because it might be very slow. Users will use set and get, and then someday in the future we'll swap out. And one other thing that I would say on this topic is I think there's a distinction between Ember being future-proof and your app being future-proof. And what I mean by that is Ember will probably be around in 5 years. Most apps that start today will be in maintenance mode in 5 years. And so it might make perfect sense for Ember to think very carefully, okay, let me make sure that it's easy for us to swap in object.observe in 3 years when it's very, very viable, or maybe even in a short amount of time under a flag or something. But when you build an app, I don't think you should be thinking about swapping into using object.observe, because basically, by the time that's really viable, your app is not necessarily going to be able to use it. It's going to be pretty far down the pike. It's going to introduce some subtle issues, et cetera. So I mean, if you're building an app that you want to be around in 5 or 10 years, by all means, that's a perfectly valid thing to think about. I tend to think that applications should be thinking more about 2 or 3 years out and less about 5 or 10 years out. Obviously, that depends on your application. So I've spent a lot of time, obviously, on the future of the web, new features, object.observe, web components, classes, all this stuff. And all these features are great. They're really awesome. But one thing that they don't really touch at all is architecture. They don't really touch how you should build your application. And one thing you hopefully noticed when you were watching me give my demo is really Ember is all about structure. It's all about, OK, I have this template. How do I get it on the screen? What route should it use? Here's a controller, right? It's all about basically helping you structure your application in terms of those 3 pieces of state that I talked about at the beginning of my talk. And so I think even if 3, 4 years down the road we get the future of our dreams, we're still unlikely to have a built-in browser solution for architecture. And so I think that's really what Ember is focusing a lot of our energy on, is how do we help you build an application where there's chunks of your application. You drop into any controller model template triple, any group of controller model template, and you have a basic idea of what it means, what it's doing, how did it get there, how did it know where to put itself. Basically trying to make it so that there's some componentization of how you think about your application. So it's not just a bunch of spaghetti that happens to be in a thing called a model or a thing called a controller. How do we actually help you build your app? How do you actually help you think about your app? This slide is what I said before, which is I think there's a difference between Ember, which plans to be around for a long time, and maybe a shorter-term app. So you should just think about this. Maybe I'm softer on this. I think if you think your application is going to be around in a long time and you plan on doing a lot of refactoring, by all means, think about what it means to swap into faster primitives in a few years. But just think about when you think, I want my app to be future-proof or I want my library to be future-proof, think about what scenarios you're thinking that you want to deal with. Not just like, in theory, it would be nice if I could swap everything for this other thing in 5 years from now. Does that make sense for your use case? Here are the features that are coming that I think that I would keep an eye out if I were you. There's modules. So modules are another thing like classes where today, if everybody, a lot of people use AMD, and that's great, and that's a good interop point. But a lot of people don't use AMD. So now if I'm like, oh, I want to use underscore, I have to cross my fingers that Jeremy Ashkenaz likes AMD that month and decided to use an AMD wrapper. Otherwise, I have to go and do my own work. And so I think what's great about modules is that they give everybody a in-the-language syntactic feature, which is basically, here's how you have modules of code. And I hope that what comes out of that is that everybody does a lot more code sharing. I'm not really of the micro-framework approach where everybody should be, you start a project and you go pick 50 micro-frameworks and try to glue them together. But I definitely think that if someone wants to use underscore and Ember, it should be extremely easy, much easier than it is today. Today it's too hard. Today it's especially hard to intermix like the Ember object model with Angular. I think that's totally fine. Like that should be fine. That should be easy. If somebody wants to do that, that should be easy. Today it's way too hard. So I hope that modules will help with that. Object.observe and array.observe are basically just primitives that are coming to the browser that will help us get information about things that are changing without having to actually override set and get or something like that, like you saw me doing, or what Angular does, which is dirty checking, which is basically like anytime the user does anything, just check everything again, which obviously may have performance issues in some cases. And so those are coming, and I'm really excited about them. I think Google has already landed an object.observe feature behind a flag, and I think other people are excited about it. Proxies, so I think the awesome thing about proxies and why I'm more excited for them in the short term is that proxies basically let you override any operation that you could do against an object. So if I want to override what happens when anybody does any get or any set, or if you call in on an object, or if you try to enumerate an object, I can override what that means for an object if I want, which means that that's probably, I think, a shorter term goal where we're basically like, if your browser has proxies, you don't have to type get and set. We can basically just like directly swap in for we can trap gets and sets automatically for you. And I've already started experimenting with that feature. I think it's a little premature because number one, proxies are still in flux and still landing. But number two, I think it's a little bit dangerous to have like a fork of the experience where, I happen to be writing a Chrome extension, so all the tutorials don't really work for me. Seems bad. I want to see a little bit more general adoption of these features before I think it's worth forking the experience for people. But keep an eye on proxies. I think proxies basically let you build an object that is like crazy browser objects, which means that you can do a lot more powerful things. Hopefully people won't abuse them. And web components I already talked about. So in closing, again, there's never been a better time to be a web developer. There's a lot of things coming down the pike. I think things like Banana Bread, which are Mozilla running a 1.5 or 2x native 3D game, really awesome. Ember gives you Ember gives you the tools you need to use the features that are coming down the pike. We're very, very sensitive to those things. But I think the one thing that I hope you take away from this that I mentioned earlier is we never, ever want to give up the URL. So Ember will always front and center say URLs, sharing via URLs, bookmarking. That is the crucial feature of Ember. We're never giving it up. Thank you very much. Do I have time for questions? A few minutes? I'll take a few questions if anybody has any. Yes, sir.
For simple things like jQuery, like chosen, for example, where would you put the initialization of that in a particle? So, the box is actually a particle.
Yeah, so simple jQuery libraries, how do you initialize them? So if what you're doing is basically you have something like jQuery UI, and you're like, whenever this thing goes into the page, I need to do something. There's a way in Ember to wrap something in what is called a view, which is like I talked about ember.view earlier. And basically what that feature does is it has a lifecycle hook that tells you when that chunk of the template has been inserted in, and you can go run whatever you want using jQuery. What we tend to say, though, is that that should be a last resort, because often you could get stuff like, I know a lot of people who were using Chosen were frustrated by the performance of having to instantiate it all the time, and basically rewrote something similar using Ember bindings, and it was like an afternoon of work and made them very happy. So I like Bootstrap better than jQuery UI in a lot of ways because it's basically just CSS, which means just HTML will work. I didn't have to do anything to make that a button. The fact that in jQuery UI you have to do like $whatever.button basically means that you have to always hook into the lifecycle, and I think that's suboptimal. So you can do it using view and did insert element is the name of the hook, but in general, if you're doing a lot of that, it could become a performance issue just because of how much stuff you're doing. Like unrelated to Ember, you're doing too much stuff when you render, therefore it's going to be slow. Yes, sir?
Is it just client-side, or is it client and server-side?
So Ember is just a client-side framework. Ember Data, which is sort of a part of Ember, and it's how a lot of people do data, has opinions about what your server-side JSON should look like that if you listen to will make your experience better, so it will make you have to write less code. But I think that's the extent to which we are coupled to any server-side framework. And we've given some thought to rendering on the server, and I think someday we will have a solution for that. But I think that's kind of orthogonal. That's like an optimization or a SEO stuff. Any other questions? OK, thank you very much. Have a nice rest of your conference.